Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and we are going to look at the concept of Chazkat Mara Kama, the presumption that something is still in the hands of its original owner. Now, what is that something? Could be metaltalin, movables, could be karka, could be land, but here's the key. We have many ways to resolve property disputes, and you've seen a lot of them. We have a property dispute. If you're sumchus, you're going to say, split the value without a shvua. If you're rabbanon, and maybe simchus sometimes too, but for a different conversation, you are going to say, hamotzi mechaver lavaraya. Somebody's holding it. The other person, in order to extract it, needs to provide evidence to aid him. We have kol dalim gvar. May the stronger party win, or leaving it alone. We have yehe munach ad sheyavo Eliyahu. We're going to hold it in escrow until Eliyahu comes in, helps us figure out what's going on, right? And Chazkat Mara Kama is the one that we see on Bava Metzia, Daf Kuf Amud Aleph. The case is machlef par bechamor. People are bartering. So there's somebody who's selling their cow, and there's somebody who's selling their donkey. So they're going to exchange them. Now, at some point during this exchange, the para gives birth. So, of course, the person selling the para says, the para gave birth when it was in my property. And of course, the person buying the para says, the para gave birth when it was already in my property. So the Mishnah says, yachloku, very simple. But the Gemara says, wait. Why yachloku? Slow down. Why yachloku? Can we actually look at where the little baby calf is right now and make the other person the motzi mechaver lavaraya? If the baby calf is on the property of the buyer, then great. The seller is the motzi mechaver lavaraya, and if you can't bring to eidim, the buyer gets to keep the vlad, gets to keep the calf. And if the calf is sitting in the property of the seller, then if the buyer wants it, that buyer is going to have to bring two eidim in order to get it, right? So simple, right? So we see that Rav Chia bar Oven says in the name of Shmuel, actually it's not so simple, because the case is a case where the calf is on neither of their properties. The calf is in a marsh somewhere, right? It's not in a place of clear ownership to anyone. So the Gemara says, okay, v'nokma chazaka de marakama. So let's say that it belongs to whoever owned the para earlier, right? Meaning nobody owns it now, meaning there's no clear proprietorship over it now. So we revert to what we would call status quo ante, whoever owned it before, right? And then and let the other person be a person who's trying to extract something that has clear ownership, namely the original ownership. The para originally was owned by the person who sold it. So, sorry, that's what it is. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe you're right, but the Mishnah follows simchus, and simchus says yachol gublo shvua. So I want to understand this logic of Chazkat Mara Kama, right? Or nokma on Chazkat Mara Kama. And it seems like there are two pieces to this. One is the item is no longer on the property of the original owner. That's what's interesting about it, right? It's like we sort of like we just rewind the tape, right? We just go back to it having been on the previous owner's property. It's almost like there's a dotted line between it and the original owner. And this brings me to the second part, which is it seems like it relies on the fact that the animal is not on anybody's new property, right? Like if the calf was found on the buyer's property, would we still say, no, it should revert to the original owner? Or would we say, no, it's on the buyer's property? And so I think these are question marks, and this is kind of what makes Chazkat Mara Kama pretty interesting. And so I want to look at the Kuntras HaSpekot. The Kuntras HaSpekot is a, essentially modern compilation. It's like an Achronish compilation that is on Choshen Mishpat, on the section of Shulchan Aruch that is talking about financial issues. And it specifically is dealing with contested money, right? And the Conceptual Sfeikot offers us two different readings of the logic behind being mokim something on Cheskat Marakam. Okay, so let's take a look. I'm going to share my screen. So we start with this. You know, it says, where do we get this idea of Cheskat Marakama? Right? Bishlama Cheskat Mamon, I understand the idea of Cheskat Mamon when somebody physically has something on their property. That's a svara. That logically makes sense. Obviously, if something is on someone's property, it belongs to them, right? About Cheskat Marakama, but this, you know, rewind the tape and put it back to status quo ante of whoever owned it before. She'ena shum adam muchzak bo. Neither of them actually physically has the calf on their property. Sheyat shnehem shavabo. That essentially they have equal, you know, they have equal possible ownership over it right now, which is none, right? Why should we rewind the tape and say it goes back to the original owner of the partner? And the other person is the one who has to bring evidence, has to bring two witnesses if they want to be able to take that calf. So he says, it's possible to say the Cheskat Marakama b'mamon, that the idea of status quo ante when it comes to contested money, meaning contested possessions, and by the way, movables or land, metaltalin or karka, maybe it comes mikoach chazaka kamaita de isura hudatya. Maybe it comes from the concept of chazaka in the sense of presuming that a status that obtained for a person, a food, in the realm of Isser v'Heter remains, even when a suffix comes up about what happened about that status, right? That is actually something that you learned a lot about in Seder Nashim, the notion that a person retains the presumptive status that they had. And so when there's a suffix about whether their status has changed, for the purposes of, I don't know, marriage is a good example, for the purposes of whether something is permitted to eat, for example, you assume that what they've been is what they still are, right? It's a chazaka kamaita, right? It's the earlier presumption about what they were. And in the same way that in the realm of Isser, in the realm of what's forbidden and what's permitted, we will establish something as still having the presumption that it had, right? Kodem shenolad hasafek, before the doubt about that status came up. Bein lehetera, bein leisura, whether that lands us in a lenient place or it lands us in a strict place, right? So it's interesting, maybe that's where it comes from. And this is such an interesting suggestion because what it would mean is there's some unified logic throughout Halakha, that there's something to status quo ante, there's something to the way things were. It's almost like the way things were are the way they're going to be, unless we have, you know, I don't know if it would be conclusive proof as much as it would be, unless we have a substantive reason to think otherwise, right? It's like, do things change or do they stay the same? Things stay the same unless you have a reason to presume otherwise. Not unless you have a doubt over whether they stay the same, but unless you have something concrete that might suggest. That doesn't have to be conclusive proof, but something more than just having a doubt. And I think that this suggestion is actually supported by another place in Shas that people point to, that even if it doesn't use the term Cheskat Marakama, seems to be working off of a similar logic. And it's a Gemara in Yevamot that is actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Explicitly comparing a case of Isura, of status for the purpose of knowing whether something is forbidden or permitted with a case of mamonot. And in Yevamot, Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, there's a discussion about situations of divorce and betrothal where a person's status is uncertain. And the Gemara wants to compare it to a case of mamon, which is the following case. They say, Midi dahave anechse de barshatia. This should be like the situation of Barshatia's possessions. Now, the name Barshatia is kind of a stage name because Barshatia means son of Shtut, right? Meaning somebody who clearly, and remember way back when we talked about what's the definition of a shota or a shota. The definition of a shota or a shota is somebody who's experiencing psychosis or delusions. So Barshatia was clearly somebody who got this label because he sometimes had psychotic periods in his life. And so we know this, that in Halakha, if somebody is itim chalim, itim shoteh, if somebody is sometimes cogent and lucid, and other times they experience psychosis or delusions, at the time when they're lucid, they are responsible for all their transactions. They're responsible for mitzvot. But at the time when they're experiencing psychosis, how could you possibly hold them responsible for their transactions, their mitzvot? It's not fair, right? So this happened that Barshatia, the Barshatia Zav Nichse, he sold some possessions. And Atu Beitrei Amri and two Adim came and said, Kishu Chalam Zabin. He was lucid when he sold them, meaning the transaction is legitimate. But another two witnesses came and said, Kishu showed the Zabin. He was psychotic when he sold it, which means we can't hold it. This transaction is not legally binding. So Amar Ravashi says, Oki Trey Lahadi Trey, put 2 versus 2, which essentially, in this case, 2 plus 2 equals 0, right? Because it's really 2 minus 2. It's these Edim versus those Edim, right? What we would call Ede Hakasha, right? Edim that, undermine the Edut because they say opposite things. And that means you have no Edut, which means you have no Raya, you have no evidence. So now what do you do? There's no evidence as to whether this should still belong to Barshatia or it shouldn't still belong to Barshatia. But the end of Ravashi's statement is Ara Okma B'Chezkat Barshatia. We are going to establish this property as still being in the presumptive ownership of Barshatia. So some people say that what we're looking at here is kind of a parallel to Cheskat Marakam. And to some extent, when the Kuntres HaSveikot says, yeah, in the realm of Isser, you have status quo ante, and in the realm of Mamonot, you have status quo ante. It's a perfect example. The Gemara itself is comparing the realm of Ishut, the realm of marital affairs, to the realm of selling one's possession, selling one's property, right? But the truth is, it's hard to sustain this logic because there's so many situations in Shas where we say, mamona me suraloyal finan. We don't learn dine mamonot from dine iser. Now, it's possible we don't learn dine mamonot, the laws of monetary transactions, from the laws of prohibition, forbidden and permitted, because first of all, you just want to keep these legal arenas separate, right? Like it's actually really important. They're each their own animal, so to speak. Another is it's possible that the logic for one doesn't obtain for the other, right? Now, I don't know if the logic of one doesn't obtain for the other because maybe sometimes we're talking about things that change less in a situation or less often in a situation of Isser and Heter, and things that change more in economic transactions, or maybe in a case of Isser and Heter, we can find a logic for it that's, maybe a fiat. And in the situation of mamonot, we actually need to be able to articulate some sort of rationale behind it, right? It's not clear why we don't always, and maybe that's a topic for a shir to begin with, of why would we not learn mamon from Isser if there's logic to it? But that's not, often it's the case that we don't, right? So the Kuntres HaSveikot gives another suggestion as to what might be going on with this Cheskat Marakama. And that is that, Cheskat Marakama is sort of like the dotted line version to what we would say is a chazaka, as in there's something that's on your property, right? Which is a very ironclad kind of ownership, right? So he says, "V'cheskat marakama me'ein cheskat mamun mamish hu." Maybe this idea of status quo ante for the ownership of something is actually similar to, if the book is in my house, it's my book, right? It's true, the book is no longer in my house in this situation of Cheskat Marakama, but the last place it was in my house. So maybe it's kind of similar, right? The Kemod b'Cheskat Mamon, that just like in the case of Cheskat Mamon, meaning when something is actually on my property, Hasvara notenet she'ein lo tzih hemenu v'lo raya, it's logical to suggest that you shouldn't be able to extract it from me without having two witnesses. Maybe it's a similar kind of thing. You shouldn't be able, it doesn't make sense if there was somebody who we know owns something, right? You can't cut that dotted line without evidence, right? Like there was somebody who owned this and nobody's disproven that. And you have to actually disprove that. If we know that it was owned by her in the beginning, but right now, the item, or in this case, the animal, is standing in the public thoroughfare or standing in a marsh, right? Still, maybe begaza de balim ita, maybe it's still considered to be ki'ilu, it's still in the original owner's home, right? Right? We think that it's as though you're still like holding it, so to speak, in your property. And I think this is very interesting because it keeps it in the realm of mamonot, and it essentially says, there's different degrees of muhzakut, right? There's different degrees of holding something, so to speak. Right here, I don't mean muhzak as in presumptive. I mean like literally to be mahzik, to be holding, right? There's different degrees. There's one degree when it's actually on your property still, or in your hands, as the case may be. And that's obviously very, very strong. But there's a weaker version or a softer version, which is we know that at some point it was on your property and it was in your hand. And that's still a dotted line and that still matters. Now, I think what's interesting here is take this logic and essentially ask yourself, what would happen if instead of the calf being in no person's land, the calf was on someone else's property? Would we still say cheskat marakam? And I think that this logic here, this second logic of saying cheskat marakama is like the poor version of muhzak b'mamon, that it's actually on your property. I think here we would say you can't say cheskat marakama if the animal is on somebody's property, because that person whose property is on has the stronger version of what it means to be muhzak b'mamon. The person who used to own it, cheskat marakama, they have the weaker version, right? So it wouldn't stand up to it, right? And the truth is that's it's pretty borne out by the sources that, the Maharsha says it very clearly. V'lo amru cheskat marakama, we're not going to use the principle of status quo ante, ela ki hacha, except in a case like this, she'ein echad mehem muhzak. Neither one of them is holding, meaning it's not on the property of either one of them, the calf. Kigon be'omedet ba'agam v'simta, if they're standing in a marsh or in a, like a little side street of the Rishon Rabbin, right? Damrinan hachal rabbanan de'itluhu ba'alma decheskat mamon mahani, right? Because in this case, we can say that the same way that rabbanan in general say hamotzi mechaver lavarai, right? In general, they say if you're machzik on mamon, if you are holding it, meaning it's on your property or you're holding it, we say that it's yours. Then the truth is the hachinami mahani cheskat marakama lahamid hamamon b'cheskato. We can say that if you were the marakama, you were holding it, and so we can say you're still holding it, right? It's as though you're still holding it. But if somebody else is holding it, meaning if it's on somebody else's property, there's no dice. what I want to end with is like a little bit of a weird shita, I would say, that Tosfot don't think is halach l'maseh, but it is interesting that they do think that Rav Yehuda b'shem Shmuel suggests this, which is a Gemara in Ketubot, Ayin Vav Amud Aleph. It goes like this. It's another one of those situations where people are machlif para b'chamor. They're bartering a cow for a donkey. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, machlif para b'chamor, umashach bala chamor et para. And what happens is the buyer of the para is moshechet, which is a type of kinyan, right? But velo he speak bal hapara l'mshochet chamor, but the buyer of the donkey, who owns the para, wasn't able to do mashicha, to pull the chamor, to make a kinyan on it, ad shemet hachamor, until the chamor died. Okay, so it's interesting. On the one hand, the person who's selling the chamor now has the para, right? They already have the money, so to speak. But the person who was buying the chamor, they never got their chamor. And now they want to say, give me back my para, give me back my money, right? So the Gemara says, or really Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, al bal hachamor lahavi raya, the owner of the donkey, the seller of the donkey, has to bring a proof shehaya chamoro kayam b'shat meshichat, that their chamor was alive when they took the para. Okay. Now, this is a little weird, to be honest, because why don't we just say, what do you mean? The para is already in the ownership of the Baal HaChamor. If the other guy wants to get the para back, the other guy has to bring evidence that the Chamor, died before the para was bought. So the Tosfot say, it seems like even though the Baal HaChamor who bought the para is literally muchzak on the para, it's on his property, right? And not only that, the cheskat haguf nami misayele. It's not just that, it's even the chamor has a cheskat haguf that it was alive, right? So like, of course, we should assume that the chamor was alive for as long as it could be, right? So v'havalan l'okmei hachamor b'cheskat shahaya kayam. We should assume that it's alive for as long as it can be alive. Elatama de Shmuel, maybe Shmuel's reasoning here is demokminan lapara b'cheskat marakam. Maybe Shmuel is saying, I don't really care. The Baal HaChamor has the para on their property. The Baal HaPara owned the Baal HaPara originally, and we have a suffix, and so we're going to revert to the Baal HaPara, who was the marakam. So here what you have is just, it's a little bit of a confusing case, so let me make it clear. What you have is party A was the marakam on the para. Party B is currently muchzak on the para because it's on their property. And yet the Gemara is saying, it reverts to party A unless party B proves that he should be able to keep it. It's very weird. Meaning it's literally on someone's property right now. So I leave the logic to people to try to figure out how could you possibly say that a cheskat marakama could work against somebody who's literally muchzak on something right now? You could come up with all sorts of logic, right? Like maybe you revert to the strength of cheskat marakama is not that it's a soft version of being muchzak on mamon. The strength of cheskat marakama is that just like in the world of Isser, we assume that nothing has changed until we have a substantive reason to think it's changed. Maybe just the weirdness of the case, the fact that we don't know when the chamor died. It's really not clear, but Tosfot say halach l'maseh, no. As much as Tosfot say halach l'maseh, but if you have a cheskat marakama versus somebody who's muchzak on something now, the person who's muchzak on something now, that's who we assume owns the item, right? Not like Rabbi Yehuda b'shem Shmuel, but things to think about. Thanks for learning with me. Looking forward to our next conversation.